Hi, welcome back to the Temple Institute, and once again, Shalom from Israel. This week on Wednesday, Thursday, I'm sorry, we will be not celebrating, but mourning on Tish Above. And I gotta admit to you, I'm gonna be very honest, I really don't like Tish Above. It's probably the worst day of the year for me. I wish it would go away, personally, and I think most people wish it would go away. And in fact, I want to show you the book that we use on Tish Above. This is the book we use. It has the Lamentations in it, which is Heihal in Hebrew, as well as the Kinot, all kinds of sad kind of verses that we say to remind us of the destruction of the temple and other times in Jewish history, such as the Chmielnicki massacres, the Holocaust, you name it. I really, really don't like Tish Above. And in fact, that's why I bought this soft cover copy, is because I really hope that we won't need to have another Tish Above. And so I'm always hopeful that by buying the soft cover, I'll just be able to put it away one day, maybe bury it as they do with Jewish books, which is called Geniza, and we won't actually have to have Tish Above ever again. So let's hope this is the last Tish Above. Unfortunately, there are some Jews who are really good at mourning, and they really get into the mourning and negative and Tish Above and everything that goes with it. And in fact, I want to relate to you a story that I heard from Rabbi Richman. We were at a board meeting of the Temple Institute, and Rabbi Richman had just been in America, and he started to talk to the board members of all what was going on there in America, who he had met with, different stories. And one story was very, very sort of, we'll call it, surprising and depressing on the one hand and almost silly on the other hand. He said that he had passed by a Jewish bookstore in New York, and they were advertising chairs for Tish Above. Now Tish Above, because it's a day of mourning, we treat it like someone who's sitting in Shiva. When you sit in Shiva over a loved one who's died, so you're meant to sit within 3 tfachim, 3 handbreadths to the ground. So you need to sit low on the ground. And Rabbi Richman said they were selling chairs for Tish Above, which were these specific chairs that you would be within those 3 handbreadths next to the ground. He said, but the sign in the window was what was so appalling. It said, Tish Above lanetzach, which means Tish Above forever. That these chairs were so good, they would last you forever for all Tish Aboves to be. And we were talking about that and saying, wow, that really represents exile, galut, thinking. We don't want that kind of thinking. That's bad thinking. And in fact, you know, one of the things that I always have to grapple with is there's so many people, including rabbis, that don't want to build the temple. And it's very shocking to me at times, because by building the temple, we get rid of Tish Above. We get rid of this mourning. We get rid of all this sadness that we have. Why not build the temple? Why would you be against building the temple? And in fact, I want to quote to you something from Maimonides, the Rambam. The Rambam wrote the 13 principles of faith, Yud Gimel Ikarei Emunah. And one of those principles of faith that the Rambam wrote, I will quote to you, and it's the 8th one. And in fact, I would strongly suggest for any Jew, it doesn't matter if you didn't go to yeshiva or you went to yeshiva, it's a must to know what our 18 principles of faith are. How can you believe in a religion without knowing those principles? So the 13 principles of faith, you can find these 13 principles in a Siddur, at the back of the Siddur in the morning prayers, which is the prayer, the Siddur is what you use to pray. Or you can find them actually in the Talmud, Sanhedrin, on the Mishnayot, which is from the time of the Tanakh period, in the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin. The Rambam actually really elaborates on each one of these 13 principles of faith and how important it is for us to know these 13 principles. Any Jew, doesn't matter where you're from, doesn't matter if you were born without knowing anything about Judaism or you went to yeshiva, it is so important to know these 13 principles. Now the 8th principle, of these 13, it says that the Torah is from the Shamayim, and that we have to believe that the Torah that we have is the Torah that was given to Moshe. He's talking about the 5 books of Moses. And that is all mipia gvura. It's all from God. Now, when I read that principle, I say to myself, if that's the case, let me open up the 5 books of Moses. And when I open up the 5 books of Moses, what do I find? God says, build me a temple. V'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. What else does God say? Come visit me 3 times a year on Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. What else does God say? He says, bring me korbanot, bring me sacrifices. And just as a side note, believe it or not, many yeshiva boys, many religious people have no understanding about what a sacrifice is meant to be. There are many people who actually think that we're throwing a live animal on the altar, which would be horrible. A sacrifice is very simple, is that we do shechita on it like we do for all kosher food. And then we take certain parts of that animal and we bring it as an offering to God on the mizbeach. We don't throw live animals on it. It's exactly that we do, almost the same process that we do for eating meat every day is what we do when we put a korban on the mizbeach, when we put a sacrifice on the altar. I want to clarify that because I've heard so many religious people who have grown up religious and have gone to yeshiva their whole life, and that's what they thought a korban is. So we have to understand that's not what it is. And it's important, and one day, not today, but we will discuss one day the idea of a sacrifice and why it isn't barbaric, why it isn't something that people think is only, certain barbaric groups do. No, it's something holy, it's something incredible, and we will discuss that at another point. But let me continue here. So when you look in the Bible and you see all these things and you see this is God's will, God's will is the most important thing. What does God want from us? What is God's will when it comes to the land of Israel? He wants us all to come. How many times does he talk about us coming to Israel? All Jews must come to Israel because that's God's will. God's will is also that we build him a temple. God's will is that we go up there and build him a temple. I cannot understand how even great rabbis are against building the temple. I fail to understand that. Maybe someone could explain it to me. But when God's will is so exact and so clear in the Bible, how can we ignore God's will? I don't know. Now, let me go on with this and explain to you how important it is for God to have a mikdash, and how bad it is for God. Even for God, the destruction of the mikdash is so bad. Let me explain to you something interesting. We go up to Har HaBayit. Har HaBayit is made up of a couple different sections. One is the actual Har HaBayit, the surrounding area, the Temple Mount as they call it. But then there's more of an inner area called the Azara. The Azara area is a place that we cannot go into because we are tamei, we are spiritually unclean. Without bringing the red heifer, we can actually not go into the area of the Azara unless, of course, it is to capture the Azara. Then there's certain dispensations that we're allowed to do. And of course, if we needed to build the temple, we certainly could go into the Azara, even if we are tamei, even if we are spiritually unclean. There's an inner area called the Heihal, okay? And that's the area where we have the menorah, where we have the golden mizbeach, where we bring the ketaret, and where we have the shulchan, where we have the breads that are placed on that shulchan. And of course, we have the inner area, which is the Kodesh Kadashim, the Holy of Holies, that only on Yom Kippur the Kohen Gadol can go into, the great priest can go into that area of the Holy of Holies. And that's where the Shekhinah is resting. Now, interesting enough, despite the fact that the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, has been destroyed, Maimonides, in his Halachot Beit HaBechira, actually says that the area still has retained its holiness, which is incredible. Meaning the Kedusha is still there, the holiness still is there. And he explains why, actually. And he said because the Shekhinah, you can never get rid of the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is not batel, ever batel. It's still there. So because God's presence, on a lower level, of course, is there, the holiness has still remained despite the destruction. And hence why we can't go into those areas like the Azara, like the Heihal, and of course the Kodesh Kadashim, which we would never be able to go in anyway. Now, I want to get into the other side of it, is the Khurban, the destruction. God is also sad about the destruction. God is upset about the destruction. And I want to share with you an incredible story On Tish Above, you're not really meant to learn Torah. And that's actually the halacha. That's the law. However, there's certain Torah you're allowed to learn, and it's sad Torahs. Torahs that have to do with the Khurban Beit HaMikdash, with the destruction of the temple. Those Torahs you can actually learn. One of those Torahs that you can learn is actually called the Sugya, the section of Kamsa Bar Kamsa. It's a section about a whole story of the destruction, what led to the destruction, and that appears actually in Tractate Gittin, which is on page 56. It's worthwhile reading, and if you can't read Hebrew and you can't read the Gemara, get an English translation, because those 2 pages of the Gemara there are just, will blow your mind, personally. And certainly on Tish Above, when there's not much to do, it's certainly something interesting to read, and you'll connect to it as well. But let me actually highlight one story that I think was incredible for me, and it really opened my eyes. And it's about Titus. Titus was the king of the Romans that ultimately destroyed the Second Temple. Okay? And the Gemara there says actually, Titus HaRasha. They refer to him as the Rasha because he was a Rasha. He killed so many Jews, of course, and destroyed the temple. But he scorned and cursed God. That's what the Gemara says. And then the Gemara says, what did he do? What was it that he cursed and scorned God? It said that he took a prostitute and went into the Holy of Holies, the place that the Kohen Gadol could only go, the high priest could only go once a year on Yom Kippur, and only after doing a lot of different acts and practices that he needed to do in order to be able to enter the Holy of Holies. But Titus went in there with a prostitute, and then he took a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll, and he opened it up, and he did his lewd act with that prostitute in the Holy of Holies. And then he took a sword, and between the Holy of Holies and the Heihal, the area where the shulchan of the showbreads are, and the menorah is, and the golden mizbeach, he took a knife and he stabbed the parochet, which is the partition between those two. It's like a curtain made with 24 threads, each one. And he stabbed it. And what the Gemara says is fascinating. And it says, V'nasa nes, a miracle happened. Vayadam mebatzpetz v'yotzei, blood bubbled and went out. It actually bled. The parochet bled. This partition bled. He actually thought, Titus, that he had killed God. Of course he didn't. And then he took that same partition, that same parochet, he made it into like a basket, and then stole all the vessels, the holy vessels of the mikdash, of the temple, and sent it off to Rome to boast, look what I did. Now, on that Gemara, on that piece of Talmud, there's one of the commentators who's referred to as the Toshfot. The Toshfot were from the 1200s. They are on every page of Gemara. And they were the students of the great Rav Shlomo Yitzchaki, Rashi, who is one of the most famous commentators on the Gemara. And I want you to hear the words he says. He says, V'nasa nes v'hayadam. There was a miracle and there was blood there. Here are the words of Toshfot. Lehodia de kasher lifnei makom Khurban Beit HaMikdash. The reason it bled, the reason that miracle happened, and how that miracle happened, was it perhaps just an allusion to Titus? Those are for other commentators to explain. But what Toshfot says here is, God wanted to show the Jewish people how hard it is for him to see the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. To God, it hurts God to the point that, it's almost ki'ilu, as they say in Hebrew. It's almost as though God was bleeding too from the destruction of the temple. That's how hard the destruction of the temple is for God. Now, I want to talk about Tish Above experience on the Temple Mount. I've had the honor of going up to the Temple Mount on Tish Above itself. And that experience is surreal. I can't even explain it to you on film of what that experience is like. It's a day of mourning, as I told you in the beginning, how much I don't like Tish Above. But when you go to the Temple Mount, it changes your focus completely. As you ascend up the stairs, there's that bridge there that you need to go up. And as you're going up, you actually overlook the Kotel Maravi, the Western Wall, or as many of you know it as the Wailing Wall, the wall of destruction from the Second Temple, the remnant of the destruction of the Second Temple. And you're watching people down there in some form or not, trying to actually find room to mourn, because it's not easy to mourn. Let's be honest. 2,000 years ago, the destruction of the temple happened. It's difficult to actually find room to mourn for the temple. But they're trying, they're doing what they can to mourn. But then there are all these Jews going up to the Temple Mount, and all they're thinking about is rebuilding. Imagine that experience. We're singing a song called Nala Nala Le Beit HaMikdash, let us go up to the Beit HaMikdash, and that will bow down on the Beit HaMikdash. What a difference of viewpoints on that day of Tish Above. And I had the honor of going out with Rav Ariel more than once to Har HaBayit. In fact, last year, I bowed down next to Rav Ariel on the mountain. And one time I was going up with Rav Ariel to the mountain. I was very frustrated. And I said to the Rav, I go, I don't understand this. When you have the solution right in front of you, the solution to build this mikdash, we have all the vessels. Mechon HaMikdash, the Temple Institute, has been building these vessels for years. They're ready to go. Why don't we build it and get rid of this Tish Above? You know what the Rav said to me? He goes, if the Medinat Yisrael, if the government of Israel were to declare that we are going to start building the Mikdash, on Tish Above we would eat meat and drink wine. That's how much how powerful that moment would be. And I just hope that we get to that point. Now I want to actually tell you something. Rav Goren, who is the first chief rabbi of the army of Israel, and also was at one point the chief rabbi of Israel in general, and also the rabbi of Rav Ariel. And the two of them, when they liberated the Temple Mount in 1967, they were actually together on the Temple Mount, Rav Goren and Rav Ariel. Rav Ariel was actually one of the paratroopers who fought to liberate the Temple Mount. And it ended up being that Rav Ariel became a student of Rav Goren and learned in his yeshiva for many years and received the smicha, which is ordination, rabbinic ordination from Rav Goren. Rav Goren was a great man. And Rav Goren, it was very dear to him, the Temple Mount as well. And he wrote a book called Har HaBayit in Hebrew, where he has maps showing you the different areas of the Temple Mount. He measured the Temple Mount using actually the army. He used the engineering corps of the army to measure the Temple Mount. And a lot what we have today is based on the maps of Rav Goren's maps that he had in his book. Rav Goren said an incredible line. I will never forget this line. I want to share it with you and leave you with this line as we approach Tish Above or already experience Tish Above. And the line by Rav Goren is such. He said, the Kotel Maravi, the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, represents Khurban and Galut, represents destruction and exile. The Temple Mount represents Geula and Binyan, redemption and building. And the question you have to ask yourself is, where do you want to be? Do you want to be with the Khurban, or do you want to be in the place of redemption and building? Let's hope this is our last Tish Above. And let's hope that we become the builders of the Temple Mount, and we'll be drinking wine and eating meat next Tish Above. Thank you very much.